Good evening, everyone. My name's Brad Cantrell. I'm the chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the University of Virginia School of Architecture. I'd like to begin with a recognition that the University of Virginia is located on the land of the Monacan people. We give our honor and respect. We also acknowledge the enslaved laborers that built the grounds and architecture and contribute to the spaces we occupy today. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's Miles M. Thaler lecturer, Billy Fleming. Thank you to the Thalers for their generous contribution to the School of Architecture and the Department of Landscape Architecture. Billy Fleming is the Wilks Family Director of the McHarg Center and the Weitzman School of Design and a senior fellow with Data for Progress. He holds degrees in landscape architecture, a master's of community and regional planning, and a doctorate of city and regional planning. His fellowship with Data for Progress is focused on the built environment and environment impacts of climate change, and resulted most prominently in the publication of low-carbon public housing policy briefs tied to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, introduced in 2019. In his role at the McHarg Center, Billy is co-editor of the forthcoming book, An Adaptation Blueprint, co-editor and co-curator of the book and now internationally traveling exhibit Design with Nature Now, and author of the forthcoming Drowning America, the Nature and Politics of Adaptation. Billy is also the lead author of the recently published and widely acclaimed The 2100 Project, an atlas for the Green New Deal. His writing on climate, disaster, and design has also been published in a broad range of venues, and he's frequently asked to weigh in on the infrastructure and built environment implications of climate change. His 2019 essay, Design and the Green New Deal in Places Journal, explores a realignment of the discipline of landscape architecture, calling for reliance on design expertise and a call to public service, as well as a critical examination of design's complicity and the problems we claim to be solving. Prior to joining Penn, he worked as a landscape architect, city planner, organizer, and later in the Obama administration's White House Domestic Policy Council. Billy's talk tonight is titled Designing a Green New Deal. Please help me in welcoming Billy Fleming.
Thanks so much, Brad. Thanks so much for having me and inviting me. I feel like we're hair twins, so it feels great to be in here with you. I should say quickly while I'm sharing my screen, just as like a little bit of introduction. I just saw really quickly Barbara Brown Wilson joined this, who was one of my city and regional planning professors at UT Austin. And I just want to say, one, like I adore her, so you should all feel really lucky that you have her there in the school. And two, like how sad I am I can't be there with you. You know, glad that we are able to do this remotely, but grew up in public housing in rural Arkansas. The South feels like many things to me. One of those is home, so miss not being able to be there with you in Charlottesville. But again, I'm just really excited to be here with you and to talk about some of the work that I and others have led in the McHarg Center around climate justice and the Green New Deal for the last couple of years. And in particular, thinking about how we can ask some questions about the best use of the power and resources that places like Penn offer in the service of the movements that I think many of us in here are interested in serving. And I've thought a lot about the work of An Underwood's Center Institute for Inequality and Democracy at UCLA as we've done that. So I'm just going to begin, now that that preamble is over, talking about what the Green New Deal is, why it takes the sort of form that it takes now, what it has to do with landscape architecture and design. It's going to require me to talk a little bit about the New Deal, and then I'm going to bring you into some of the present, some of the work that we're actually doing now in the center that Brad mentioned there in the intro. So, I think just at the beginning, so 3 years ago now, as I'm sort of beginning some of this work, really before HR 109, which is kind of the foundational document that introduced the Green New Deal to the public, was made public. Talking with a number of the organizers and economists and other folks who were behind to kind of push to drive that framework forward, and sort of looking at the work they put forward in ways that are very acutely or very intimately tied to design. So I think a lot of people look at HR 109 as like a bit of industrial policy, a bit of economic policy, a bit of kind of abstract spatial policy. And it certainly has those pieces to it, but it also has a lot in there for folks who work in the built environment, which certainly includes landscape architects, urban planners, the sort of suite of built environment professions. And doesn't feel quite as, I don't know, like radical to say this now, 2 or 3 years after this work began, but there was a ton of pushback. Some of you probably know within at least ASLA around the idea of even beginning to talk about the Green New Deal. That has since changed. We can talk about that in the Q&A if folks want to, but I think for us, like very fundamentally at the beginning of all of this, it was just clear that, right, there's a lot in HR 109, building resiliency against climate disasters, achieving a zero emission energy standard, retrofitting every existing building in the country for max water and energy efficiency, remediating every hazmat or brownfield site in the US, just a ton in there for landscape architecture, urban planning to think about. It requires us to think about some things differently, and it also doesn't require us to think about everything differently. There's a lot of this work that we already do. But for us, it was really important to sort of ask questions about how and where and why design should get involved in the sort of climate justice movement through the Green New Deal. And one of the reasons for that, right, is just that, people have asked before, like, what about Project Drawdown? What about Waxman Markey? What about all of these other climate plans that have been put forward either in recent years or in, the last, say, 10, 15 years of climate policy making in the US? And the most obvious one, at least at the moment, right, is that there is no like comprehensive alternative to it. We're happy to entertain other alternatives that are on the table, but it's completely unique amongst other climate plans in the US in that it actually attempts to fuse the more technocratic demands of climate policy wants, which are mostly around reducing carbon emissions or decarbonization, with the aims of blue collar workers, which are typically about jobs, right? Like, what do we do with 300,000 displaced fossil fuel workers if we're going to manage the decline of the oil and gas industry? And then coupling that with the demands of frontline communities. So how do we actually think about historic sites of disinvestment and violence as sites of investment in plenty and abundance through something like a Green New Deal? And these are demands that, like, they're not mine. They're put on the table by the mostly young and mostly people of color who've been leading the climate justice movement, both locally and across the entire country. And thinking about sort of why the Green New Deal looks the way it looks, why it really takes those three pillars seriously, why it's scaled to such a large degree to like the size of the American economy. I think numbers have been thrown around that it might cost anywhere from 2 to 100 trillion, depending on who you ask. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want as well. But part of the reason it's sized in this way, that it's really responding to, in many ways, a sort of hangover from the failure of ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, what's more sort of commonly known as the Obama stimulus in 2009 and 10. This is a book from Reed Hunt, who was a colleague when I was there in the DPC at the White House, who was much more senior than me, and so really involved in a lot of these early conversations about how to design that particular bailout package or stimulus package. And he came away, I think, like a lot of us, quite disappointed with it and a lot of other parts of say, the first term of the Obama administration. And there are lots of things in the book that are really important to take with us, but the three that are really important when thinking about why the Green New Deal looks and is the way that it is today, is that in his analysis, right, the ARA, the Obama stimulus, was way too small, so less than $1 trillion, which, at the time, I think seemed large to folks and now seems kind of comically small in the scale of all the COVID relief packages that have been put forward. It was far too targeted towards Wall Street and big business and large firms. And the other is that it was a one-time funding bill. So there are no what were called automatic stabilizers that would keep the money flowing and take some of that decision-making out of congressional hands if they needed to go back to the well to continue funding things. The other thing I would say quickly about this too is that, ARA had attached to it something called a shovel-ready standard. So projects on the infrastructure side couldn't be built unless they were literally at the shovel-ready stage. They had CDs, they had everything, all their permits pulled, everything they needed to do, and they were just waiting on funds. That meant in 2009 and 10 that we built a lot of things that no one actually wanted. They were many of them artifacts of the earmark era that ended in 2005 or 6 and had been sitting on a shelf for a decade before that. And they just happened to be the only things we could build at the time quickly. And this is also, those are the kind of like public plans, government plans that the Green New Deal is responding to. The other is just that the Green New Deal is emerging in this vacuum in part because some folks on the private side already have their own plans for how to ride out the climate catastrophe. This was treated a little bit as comically a couple of years ago. This is a plan for Silicon Valley hedge funders in DCs to retreat from their offices, guarded by paramilitary forces, go to their private hangars in the desert and fly to New Zealand when the shit hits the fan. And it was covered pretty prominently in the New York Times Magazine's climate issue a year and a half ago now, and really dug into what the Pinkertons, who we could talk forever about the Pinkertons and their horrible history in this country, but their business model for the 21st century, sort of 2020 going forward, was to offer their services to heads of state, and to the Fortune 500's C-suites for this exact scenario, to basically guard them in their bug out scenarios. And I said that was, treated kind of comically a couple of years ago, except now, when, as we've watched what happened with COVID-19, we've watched a lot of these folks actually follow that plan. So this is just one person, one who for some reason decided to give an interview about how he had this giant multi-million-dollar bunker and why he went there guarded by armed paramilitary forces to sort of ride out the pandemic. But I say all of that, right, because the Green New Deal is emerging as like a public alternative to this much more dire scenario for us. Either a government plan that isn't sized to the scale of the climate crisis, or the lack of a government plan leaving folks like this to sort of handle their business themselves, and the rest of us to sort of, be on our own. So, thinking about that, like in the context of Reed's book, this is coming from Nancy Levinson, the editor of Places Journal, back in 2010, so 10 years ago, and not calling it a Green New Deal, but actually really thinking a lot about what a Green New Deal might become. And to her at the time, thinking about the Obama stimulus, it seems increasingly clear that the Great Recession is not sparking a new New Deal, and that we confronted our crisis then in a climate that's contemptuous to the very idea of the public. And I think for us anyway, it sort of requires us to begin a conversation like this by thinking about the New Deal. Green New Dealers have chosen this as kind of their central reference, the New Deal, which has many flaws and imperfections we'll talk really quickly about. But because it's their reference, we at least have to really consider its legacy in the built environment and social systems of this country. And I always like to do that starting with a slide one, because a couple of these images are probably familiar to you. The other is that there's this insane poster of a dinosaur and syphilis that I had to see in some archival research, so I figured all of you have to see it now too. And to pull from Nancy one more time, right? This is about a year and a half ago, or a little over a year ago now, at an event we put on here. Really, I think laying out, trying to do a little bit of myth busting about what the New Deal really was. And saying here that the New Deal is best understood not as an overarching plan, but as a series of improvisations held together not by theory, but by strategy. And this is particularly important for us, right? Because I think, the Green New Deal is often framed as, in the popular imagination, as a single piece of legislation. It has a price tag attached to it. If you hear about it on Fox News, it also has a ban on airplanes and hamburgers attached to it. But what it's really describing is an era of policymaking, right? Or a generation of policymaking. HR 109 gives you the kind of framework in which climate justice movement leaders have kind of imagined that package of bills and executive actions adding up to a Green New Deal. But like the New Deal, it's held together by strategy, not theory. And the New Dealers really confronted this in their own series of overlapping crises here. One being their own ecological crisis, the Dust Bowl, the forced migration of 3.5 million folks from the Great Plains to California, most of them to the Central Valley of California. The second being their own sort of economic crisis, the Great Depression. The third being their own political crisis, the rise of fascism around the world. And the New Deal, really was not, it was something that FDR mentioned in passing in a few of his addresses in his first campaign, but didn't really come together until he was sworn into office in January of 33. And we have to imagine the New Deal, I think, in popular imagination as being many things. One of them is its non-spatial gift to us, which is our only real social welfare program in the US that's universal, Social Security. But it also built around 60,000 or so built environment projects all around the US. Places large and small. Some are familiar to you probably, like the Appalachian Regional Trail, the Tennessee Valley Authority, these big mega projects. It also built, tens of thousands, literally, of post offices, public schools, public housing. In the case of my alma mater, the University of Arkansas, I built their football stadium. And for you, in Virginia, just to do a really quick, fly around, this is from the site, The Living New Deal, which is something you should spend some time thumbing around through if you really want to. You also have not a ton, but a little bit of a built environment legacy left over from the New Deal. Just north of you, kind of halfway to Harrisonburg, right, you have the Shenandoah National Park, Lewis Mountain Campground, built by the CCC. Your campus, the Alderman Library. And thinking about the New Deal in this way as not a top-down mandate, which is again is a way it's often framed, in the popular imagination, but as actually just a partnership, a mass transfer of federal funds to state and local government to implement and guide projects kind of as they saw fit. And here I'm drawing on a colleague, Brent Siebel, and some partners from their really fantastic book, Shaped by the State. He's writing that intergovernmental partnerships facilitated the New Deal state building by creating an administrative structure within which the coalition could hold together and bind local elites to specific initiatives. New Dealers succeeded in expanding and enhancing the state's reach. In these momentary and expedient compromises, he created a state that was at once robust and highly contingent, nimble and porous. And he goes on to talk about how the New Deal's focus on devolving federal power to state and local government really allowed it to hold these radically different political coalitions together over the course of the 10, 15, 20-year period that the New Deal coalition held. And by that, I mean, sanitary sewer socialists in the Midwest and the North benefited as much from this as, say, Jim Crow Dixiecrats in the South. And both of those coalitions were allowed and empowered to flourish through the New Deal. And in the design world, we often, I think, look to the TVA as kind of an exemplar of what New Deal state building or state power could really do. I think it's done us a huge disservice to focus so much attention on the TVA. It's not surprising why we have. It was run by architects and landscape architects, and we love nothing more than like self-mythology. So of course we want to focus on the TVA. It's also beautiful as like a piece of infrastructure and was designed to be so. It was intended to both provide hydroelectric power and be a spectacle. And the system, the TVA system of dams and locks and levees, became the second most visited swath of public land after the National Mall for a period in the mid-century from 1945 to 65. And so in that way, it was like wildly successful. And also because it was, contingent upon, empowering and sending resources to the existing political economy of Tennessee Valley in the 1930s, required FDR to be okay with empowering and lengthening and strengthening the Jim Crow coalition that sort of ruled the day there. And it's why when you look at the literal physical imprint of the TVA on the land, it had separate but equal segregated facilities, black and white water fountains there, and then also in the labor force, again, pulling from Brent Siebel. Despite Black residents constituting over 7% of the population around the North Stand, which we look at a picture of, they made up just about 2% of the workers who qualified for TVA jobs. And rural electrification promised significant improvements in standards of living for some rural Americans, but the privileges and equities of Jim Crow were left largely untouched. And all of those things, like holding all of those things in our head too. Also, the TVA has one of the dirtiest fuel mixes in the country. For folks who are like really into, which we can talk about in the Q&A, the public power debate that's kind of raging now in climate and energy world, whether we should own utilities or the energy system, or that should be left up to private operators. The TVA is often cited by opponents of public power as what happens when we give this over to the public sector, because it has a huge coal and natural gas mix in its fuel load. Lots of reasons for that have to do with the literal political economy of the Tennessee Valley, and not with who owns it. But again, I think investing so much time in the TVA has really done us a disservice. And again, it's not perfect, but the Rural Electrification Administration offers us, I think, some more interesting examples, some more interesting ideas of what we might be able to build on through something like a Green New Deal. And this was work from students of mine in a studio last fall. You can see all of their names there at the bottom right. Looking at the REA's physical footprint of the United States, or in the United States. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'll say quickly, right, that one of the things that they pulled out of this is that the REA over the course of the New Deal builds about 380,000 miles of rural electric transmission line. It's about 40% of all the line ever built in the history of the country. They, not the TVA, are primarily responsible for taking rural counties of the US from 10 to 97% electrification over the course of the New Deal. And they also create, and they still exist today, about 900 or so rural electric co-ops. So these are, electric utilities run by farmers and nurses and all kinds of other, and teachers and all kinds of other folks in rural parts of the US. You can thumb through this map if you really want and probably find out you used to get power or might still get power from a rural electric co-op. And it also just had a scale that the TVA didn't have, and a sort of democratic, small d democratic distribution that the TVA didn't have. The TVA, I mean, frankly, is one of the most autocratic institutions in the US. So the TVA ultimately comprises an expanse of about 41,000 square miles, roughly the size of England, while the REA is building out a national program that eventually operates in 46 states. And I won't spend a ton of time on the other sort of alphabet agencies in the New Deal, although again, we can talk about these all you want in the Q&A. But just to say, if you've been to Chicago, this is Midway Airport, you probably then have been through a New Deal era municipal airport. And so over the course of the New Deal, what would become the FAA, the Civil Aeronautics Authority, is appropriated and spends about $1 trillion in adjusted funds to build out the municipal airport infrastructure of the US. The REA does the same, but for about 200 billion for the Rural Electrification Administration. And the CCC, again, puts about over the course of the New Deal about 600,000 or so, mostly young men working with hand tools to work building out the shelter belts, the state park infrastructure, a lot of the other sort of leisure and recreational infrastructure of the United States. And again, we often think about the New Deal as kind of a blue collar, like hard labor, jobs guarantee program. That's what the CCC was, I think, in many ways. There's also, this is pulling from Phoebe Cutler's really excellent book, The Public Landscape of the New Deal. There's also in many ways kind of a soft jobs guarantee for white collar professional services industries like landscape architecture and city planning. And she's just looking here at all the places where landscape architects found civil service employment over the course of the New Deal. Many of them still exist, not all of them. And you can spend as much, I see Brad like zeroing in on this, you can spend as much time on this thing as you want to. But I think, again, it's like an interesting question for us. The New Deal emerges at a time when we had a really underdeveloped state in the US, very few sort of federal and state institutions. Our first planning commissions were really just coming online at this time. And we find ourselves now probably grappling with some similar questions about whether or not the institutions at our disposal are actually equipped to deal with the various overlapping crises of the 21st century. And for them to grow and be sized to the scale of our climate and economic and racial justice crises, it's going to require some new state building. And it's going to require us to think about whether or not there's a place in those institutions for landscape architects. And just to begin to kind of wind down the New Deal part of this before we get into kind of the present and the future, to pull from Brent one more time, well, I'm almost certain as a UVA history grad, the pragmatic political utility of local administrative autonomy and public-private partnership were an essential part of the New Deal. The American federal structure simultaneously presented a tool and a barrier. It made possible the New Deal's most ambitious programs, and it enabled some of the most progressive parts of the New Deal to persist at the state and local level once the winds of national politics had changed. But beneath the cheery language of partnership often lay a bitter truth. The prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities. And this is in large part, right, because FDR had zero theory of power, zero theory of change in crafting the New Deal's programs. Was not interested in challenging existing power structures at the state or local level, and in many ways was mostly interested in binding local electeds, whether they be socialists or conservatives or anyone in between, to his particular infrastructure and built environment and jobs programs. And for Green New Dealers, this is one of the sort of central unanswered questions, one that we've spent a little bit of time with and will continue to spend time on, is how do we think about large scale, sort of massive national investment as a tool for restructuring power, for making choices about who to elevate and who to dislodge. And I think, as Brad mentioned, to begin to bring us into the present, so how we've engaged with this work. Some of this began to become public when this piece was published about 1.5 years ago, which begins with a line that won me all kinds of friends on landscape architecture. I don't know when the myth of landscape architects as climate satires began, but I know it's time to kill it. But that essay, this work has really been organized around a couple of sort of key questions. One, they're basically reframing each other. Can a set of practices tied to luxury real estate deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by global warming and inequality? Or put another way, can design be both an instrument of neoliberalism or capitalism and an activist force in the fight for climate justice? And I think the answers to those questions, at least to me, are quite obviously no. And then the answer then becomes, what do we do about those things? So how do we think about alternatives? And for us anyway, that's been kind of organized through 4 streams, which I'll go through just a second here. One has been on this development of, say, public tools, which you see kind of in the top left there through an atlas for the Green New Deal. And the top right has been this sort of creative and design research work we've done, often, well, I should say always, in partnership with either local or national climate justice orgs and movement leaders. And then in the bottom left has been this process for us to begin making some of those more abstract and placeless demands far more concrete. So when we've worked with public housing residents in Kansas City through the People's Action Homes Guarantee, taking their demands for 10 million new units of public housing across the United States over the next 10 years, and turning that into instruments that policymakers can then fold into legislative language, and doing it in ways that, again, bring in some creative scholarship through work we've led in the center. And then finally, in the bottom right there, I think I've jumbled these around a little bit, so it might not be exactly in this order, but in the bottom right there, you see a really quick shot from the event I mentioned last fall, Designing a Green New Deal, where really the entire purpose of that event was to bring designers and planners into a sort of collision course with some of the climate justice leaders who've been pushing the framework or the idea of the Green New Deal for years at that point, to begin to ask some of these questions about how the Green New Deal gets translated into different aspects of the built environment. And for all of this work, at least for me anyway, the kind of theory of change has been that no one will ever understand something like the Green New Deal or any other national climate change investment program through changes in, say, the carbon molecules in the atmosphere or the electrons in their circuits. So we're not going to log on to Zoom together in 2030, hopefully because Zoom is abolished and it doesn't exist anymore. But also because if we do, we're not going to log on and notice that like our computers are powered by wind instead of coal. It's really important that they are, that some other non-carbon emitting source, but we're not going to notice that. What we will notice, right, are the material investments in where we live and how we live, in our houses, in our communities, in our commutes, and the places we go to work and play. And those can take many different shapes and forms. And communicating that is particularly important now, when the Green New Deal itself has really been successfully framed in many places by the right as this, like, again, anti-hamburger, anti-airplane bill for scarcity that will cost you your job. And actually, the Green New Deal is a massive jobs program for almost everyone in the US who doesn't have the luxury of sitting in, say, a C-suite at Exxon. And so for us, there are kind of, again, these two questions that are bound this work together. One is how do we balance the need to build more than we've ever built, faster and better than we've ever built it, with our responsibility to live up to democratic principles and self-determination. And this is a question on the implementation side of what do we do, say, with a $2 trillion Biden stimulus plan that we might think of as a down payment on the Green New Deal? How do we ensure we do that living up to this the sort of question, or the tensions provoked in this question? And then how do we translate the demands of the climate justice movement into compelling, concrete images and stories and policies that can really advance their vision? Not simply to illustrate it, although we can do that, but to actually, through the process of design research, advance their project through things that are in our wheelhouse as designers. And so to go through these kind of four categories pretty quickly, right? On the tool building side, this is something that maybe is familiar to you. If not, the URL is at the top of this. It's called An Atlas for the Green New Deal. The intent here, this project came together after a number of conversations with folks at the Sunrise Movement, at We Act, at a few other EJ and CJ orgs, who, none of this is new to them. Most of it's probably not new to you. But most of this information, as you know, for anyone who works in the sort of spatial analysis or data viz world, in which Brad does a million things in that world, a lot of this information, a lot of this data is not readily or easily available to folks outside of the academy or outside of the consulting world. And so for us, it was really important to take this smattering of climate and built environment data, some historical, some contemporary, some projective, and put it in one place, give it over to anyone who had internet access to be able to use it, and to make it, as much as we could, illustrative and beautiful and would draw people into it. And so here you're looking at just a really quick screen recording, which I just learned I could do. This is like the most boomer thing about me. I just figured out how to record my screen on my laptop. So you're seeing one of the first versions of that. But in it, we did all kinds of things. Here you're looking at a video of Matthew Hauer's work, beginning to model who will be displaced due to sea level rise and where they might move over the course of the 21st century. So there's 100+ images like that throughout this atlas. And this is, a zoom in of Matt's work here. Matt's a geographer at Florida State. He's really been like the leading person on this question in the US. So there's been that tool building piece that we focused some resources on. The second has been thinking about, Penn as an institution, which I had many complicated feelings about, came up again, through public schools and public education. Penn in many ways feels like an alien place to me sometimes. But thinking about, what it has to offer to the climate justice movement at this particular moment. And the answer to that question is usually pretty simple. It has some platform, it has some power, it has some resources. So how do we think about redistributing all of those things to folks who might not have the same platform that we do? And for us, at least at this one event, we've done, a dozen or so others like this over the course of my time at the McHarg Center. We really, again, it was about putting these groups of people together, like you see on stage here, and then sort of giving our platform over to them to be able to talk about something radical like, the complete restructuring of the American economy in ways that balance racial justice and climate justice and economic justice, in a school of design where those have never been, say, front of mind concerns, or at least not amongst the entire school. And so on stage here, you see my state rep at the podium, Elizabeth Fiedler. Next to her is Karine Talo, who runs the government affairs program at WEACT. Next to her is David Roberts, who writes about energy and climate stuff at Vox. Next to him is Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who runs the climate program at the Roosevelt Institute. Next to her is Leah Stokes, who's a political science professor at UC Santa Barbara. And then next to her are Allison Lassiter and Ellen Nisis on our planning and landscape faculty at Penn. And really that day was about like, how do we take this grand vision, this abstract set of goals in HR 109 and begin to think about some of these implementation community level questions that have really been at the core of the center's work for the last couple of years. And here you can see Varshini Prakash, who's the head of the Sunrise Movement, sort of ending the panel portion of the day with the song, which is a thing organizers tend to do. And in many ways, it was like a really remarkable day for the school. This is our biggest auditorium on campus, holds about 1,400 people. Our provost opened the event up for us that day and quipped, and I don't think he thought it was going to be this funny, but quipped that even Joe Biden couldn't fill this auditorium up the way that this group we assembled that day had. So this was literally at one point packed at capacity, 1,400 people. And for those of you who are like, I don't know, like either political or design nerds like me, which I assume most of you are, you can see kind of in the middle there, we have basically the DSA Eco-Socialist Caucus standing next to Naomi Klein, standing next to some of the scions of corporate architecture in the United States and abroad. It's really like one of the most eclectic smatterings of people we've ever drawn to an event. And was just an incredibly energizing day in all kinds of ways for me personally, but also for the school. And it's really continued into some of our work that's still going on. Outside of that programming, then, like one of the other ways we've taken this work on has been through this process of working as, in many ways, like a go-between between climate justice movement leaders and members of Congress. In this case, through a variety of conversations with folks at Sunrise Movement, folks working for then newly elected Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and others, zeroed in on public housing as kind of the first place to channel our energy, the investment side of what a Green New Deal might offer. And here, this is a bill we helped write. So basically got to take the model or the shell legislation from her staff, begin to flesh it out in partnership with a bunch of congressional attorneys, and in partnership with People's Action and the Homes Guarantee. And a lot of this work was, co-led with my work partner here at Penn, Dana LaDonna Cohen, in sociology. But really, again, thinking about public housing as a critical site, a critical priority in the sort of initial rollout of the Green New Deal. So asking questions about where resources should go first and how they should be used through AOC's leadership, and then eventually joined by Senator Sanders and others, really zeroed in on public housing for all kinds of reasons. One being, for anyone who knows anything about public housing, it had, in this country, it has a really shameful backlog of public health, asbestos, lead, and indoor air pollution due to poor ventilation and gas stove problems. HUD's most recent estimate of the backlog of deferred maintenance work in these units is around $70 billion. Through some work we did as a part of this project, figured out you could basically take care of all of that work and get them to the closest to net zero you can get any housing unit to in the United States for about double that. So for about 140 billion, you could basically clear out all of the deferred maintenance backlog in public housing and get them to basically net zero. And that initial bill got lots of attention, which was great, but now has the support of the building trades unions and seems pretty likely to become a part of the Biden administration's first stimulus package. And you can see there's a wealth of other research and supporting work we have that lives on this site now. I can drop a URL to once we get to that point. And we've been doing similar work with other partners around transportation. This has now become part of something within the center that we just announced maybe a month ago, but I think I saw Daryl Young on here, who's my funder for this. So hello, Daryl, if you're on this call. But this is part of something called the Climate and Community Project that the Summit Foundation was really the first foundation to invest in. It seems like we have a couple more who are about to come in. And it's about taking, this network of movement connected, policy wonks who are working at this intersection of, say, climate change and the built environment on the left, and connecting them to movement groups and connecting them to members of Congress to think about how we advance the principles of the Green New Deal through concrete, certainly like, applied research, and then hopefully also down the line legislation. And I won't spend a ton of time on this. Here's a weird screen zoom shot because I feel like my life is just Zoom now. So I'm going to do like a little meta Zoom within a Zoom thing for you here. But this is us basically briefing a couple of incoming members of Congress on the CCP, the Climate and Community Project's work a couple of days ago. Some of these names are probably familiar. You can see Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush there, Marie Newman. They're all newly elected Justice Democrats, one for Brooklyn, one from St. Louis, one from Chicago. And talking about a joint project we're working on that Bowman's office has become interested in around the Green New Deal for public schools, which is modeled in many ways on the public housing bill I mentioned earlier. And the sort of bigger CCP project, which we have not fully rolled out yet, that'll happen in about a month, includes this kind of cast here. And I won't go through all of them. Some of these folks are probably familiar to you. Carlos Martin at the Urban Institute, Daniel O'Donoghue, who I mentioned, Mishin Cha, who's been kind of all over the place the last few months. But also Shalonda Baker, Susie Hobbs Baker, Miles Lennon, all kinds of folks who are doing really, really interesting work at the intersection, again, of climate and the built environment, or climate and design, and being able to use this program, the CCP, as a way to both give them resources to do more of that kind of work and to connect them to folks on the ground and folks in DC to begin channeling all of those demands into concrete legislation and projects. And so to begin to kind of like wrap this up so we can have a little more conversation, the last piece where this has really been, a focus for me has been in my teaching through. So this is where, for me anyway, I teach interdisciplinary option studios here. It's a place where all of this research both like lives, people get to like use it in their work, but also they advance the research. So the studios become an engine for us, or for me, in a lot of the work that I do. And typically, I get a fair amount of flack for this from my colleagues, but often have like giant juries. So we just had our mid-review for my studio this fall. There were 22 jurors in that studio. And really the idea is to have like some of the deeper, longer conversations about the work rather than say like the aesthetics of the boards in some of those reviews. And so just to back up for a second to walk you through the way that I've structured what's now the second year of a 3-year kind of Green New Deal studio sequence. Last year's group, we began by, I think, beginning where this lecture began, thinking about what HR 109 has to offer, has to say about the built environment and landscape architecture, spending time in seminar, close reading and discussion, talking about the built environment legacy of the New Deal, which includes reading a whole bunch of critical race theory about the New Deal, and then spending time doing sectoral analysis of the US to really begin asking our students to respond to a couple of open-ended questions. And for us in that first studio last year, those questions were, what are the parts of the country that from a technical perspective, we have to win or get right to achieve the jobs, justice, and carbon goals of the Green New Deal? And from that smaller universe of potential places, what are the parts of the country you would put first in line for investment, either because they're historic sites of disinvestment and or because they offer you an opportunity to really grow your political coalition if you make the material benefits of this kind of investment program really obvious, upfront to them. And for I think our students made a bunch of really smart choices. They picked Appalachia, they picked the Mississippi Delta, and they picked the Corn Belt of the Midwest. Lots of other places you could focus, but those are the 3 they chose. And you can see here, this is part of their mapping process for getting to those 3 places. And then again, rather than asking them to produce a bunch of kind of final boards, say that we're all black and sit around and point at and use them to talk about our own work, which sometimes happens in juries. We asked them to produce a public exhibition of ideas, and to use the exhibition space to give a curator's talk about the work that they sort of self-organized, and then to program a series of panel discussions amongst themselves and with a couple of our guests on the jury throughout the semester as well. As a part of that exhibition, asked them to produce, all kinds of things. One of those was propaganda. So if we were to think about, how the elements of the Green New Deal are communicated in ways that, are relate to but are different from the way the New Deal thought about this, how might you think about selling this kind of package in this case in a place like Appalachia, in the Mississippi Delta and parts of the Midwest? How do you think about developing, say, imagery or what they were calling archives of the future? That could tell this story in ways that are compelling and creative and push us beyond these really fraught conversations about, who has to lose through different aspects of the Green New Deal, and actually talk about, a world of plenty and abundance that it might offer. And in this case, for them, they included these Instagram, mock-ups, but also included this weird Mississippi River Drowning Man event, which I assume was just like you take a bunch of mushrooms and walk into the Mississippi River, which sounds great if it's clean. But this is coming from a couple of students who really dug into that side of this. And then, it also we asked them to produce some more conventional drawings, right? This is one that's probably familiar to you in many ways, section of a particular ridge in Appalachia, or ridgeline in Appalachia. And it's really like in a pretty didactic way, trying to show folks what it would look like to actually build out all the things the Green New Deal has called for there, which is this massive clean energy generation, storage, and transmission system, the use of abandoned coal mines to act as low-tech batteries, pumped hydro storage reservoir, to invest in recreation and public land, which you can see kind of weaving its way through. And then they also have, kind of off in the distance, some of the timber protection and CLT housing stuff they've thought about. And then sort of outside of those more conventional images, we also asked them to think about how to creatively tell some of these stories in ways that maybe don't necessarily lend themselves to plans and sections and perspective drawings the way we're used to making them. And one of our students decided to just basically write a graphic novel about pre and post Green New Deal life in the Midwest. And you're just seeing a couple of snapshots, pre and gray, post in this kind of taupe here of what that looks like. There are a few more of these we could get into if we really wanted to. But again, then just a couple of quick shots from the day of students kind of walking folks through the gallery, looking at the work, talking about it, not necessarily talking about it at the boards the way you would typically do it, although you see some of them kind of standing in front of their work, but having some larger conversations about the themes, and honestly also too the struggles of trying to run an open-ended studio like this on a topic that we hadn't covered before. And that work, I'm not going to make you look at all of this, but I will say, if anybody wants to, I'll drop a link to this. They took it upon themselves to build an online gallery space for all of this work. So on Exhibit, if you haven't used it before, it's not exactly a mock-up of Meyerson Hall, which is really to their benefit, because Meyerson Hall is just a dreadful place. But you can always peruse here and see all of the work. I'm just going to zip through really quickly as they've kind of relayed it out for you. Yes, I'll drop a link to that. And that, that work, that was a phenomenal group of students. There were many times that semester where I think that work could have fallen apart. They were fantastic. They just won the Award of Excellence for Student Collaboration from ASLA, which they absolutely deserve. They were wonderful, wonderful students. A couple of them are now teaching or set to teach in the spring of 2021 Green New Deal studios elsewhere. As a part of this, the super studio that we're joining our friends at the LAF, ASLA, Columbia, their Center for Cities and Landscapes with Kate Orff, and a couple of others in convening. And I think when we set out to do this, 8 months or so ago, 6 months ago, I think in our wildest imagination, we thought we'd get 30 to 40 different Green New Deal studios across the country. We have 140 registered, I think, as of yesterday. And that's mostly for the fall. About a third of those are for the spring. So we expect to have more in the spring as well. Both good and bad. It's fantastic. All of this creative work will now be sort of channeled into imagining what a world rebuilt by the Green New Deal will be. But it also means that Kate and Richard and Barbara and I now have to review 8 times more work than we thought we did. So it's gonna be a long summer. But for me, in the second version of this studio, I've asked students to come back to the Midwest, Appalachia, and the Delta, and to really center 3 industries in their work this fall. And these are 3, so I sit on something called the Green New Deal Network. This is the national organizing table for the Green New Deal world, for the climate justice world. It has a couple hundred orgs that kind of have representation on it. In May, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a request was made by them, which was then accepted, to merge with the Movement for Black Lives, at least in some informal ways, through this organizing table. And as a result of that, these 3 industries really became foregrounded for lots of people, but especially for me in thinking about how to structure another version of this studio. And so the 3 industries they've kind of put to us as key to thinking about a world rebuilt by the Green New Deal are industrial agriculture, the fossil fuel system, and the carceral system. And so our students are now sort of taking those 3 on in those 3 places. And this required them, looking at Appalachia, to ask questions about land ownership, and commodity markets. And so again, we've begun the studio with nobody drawing, nobody doing any analysis or data gathering really, but to read and talk and think about these places before we think about what we should do there, and to connect with local folks who are doing climate and environmental justice work in each of them. And this is pulling, from one of the seminars that we had with Rita Brown from UCLA, writing about folks in West Virginia. Mountaineers understood their relationship to the land through alternative means of property ownership. And this ideological mismatch created the conditions for Northern oligarchs to come in and purchase for pennies on the dollar nearly all the land in central Appalachia. She goes on to write about, this as well. The black men from Alabama possessed something invaluable to the coal companies of West Virginia, which is experience. Black folks were used as free labor in Southern mines before and after emancipation, as enslaved labor in the antebellum era, and then through the convict leasing system after. And corporations operating in Eastern Kentucky knew to target their recruiting efforts in Alabama to those particular folks because they owned those mines too. And just to give you a sense, this is from John Giventz's book, looking at land ownership in Appalachia, just how complicated the absentee land ownership system is there. There's a reason why there's so much abandoned land in Appalachia. It's because any one of these little squares you see here can immediately be declared bankrupt and dissolved, and all of the land in its ownership structure is then left to the public sector to clean up. So we ask students to do a little bit of this kind of power analysis and forensic mapping, essentially, of land ownership in Appalachia as one of their first kind of assignments. In the Delta, I've asked them to really think, about the historical and contemporary implications of the plantation economy there, or the planters. And so here, pulling from Clyde Woods, plantation regimes create, institutionalize, and manage extreme levels of conflict. Therefore, the current crisis in the Delta is not one of failed policies, underclass behavior, or rural poverty, or social backwardness. Responsibility for the coexistence of great poverty beside great wealth rests squarely at the feet of a dominant regional bloc that has fought every effort to expand the parameters of social, economic, and cultural justice. And have asked them now, with those things in mind from those seminars, to kind of move through this process over the course of the studio, which again is, we have a lot of my partners from, the policy-focused research I talked about, from the programming I talked about, and from the kind of public tool building work I talked about, are all involved in the studio. So they're in either for desk crits, for reviews, for lectures, whatever it might be. And it's a way for us all to think about what it is we can offer in, say, the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months to sort of advance this particular project, the Green New Deal project. And so in the studio, they just finished. They just had their mid-review Monday. And I asked them to basically construct regional atlases, a manifesto, which we had anti-manifesto conversations about. So we all kind of hate the manifesto, but nevertheless settled on it. And to propose a few sites to focus in on for the sort of rest of the semester. So if you think about last year's group is beginning nationally and ending regionally, this group is beginning regionally and zeroing in on particular sites as a way to sort of think about, the transformative power of abolishing those 3 industries in each region. They're now getting into what's called here movement-led speculation. They're basically choosing storytelling devices. Might be graphic novels, might be reimagined farmers' almanacs, it might be workbooks, it might be many things that they'll produce instead of, again, sort of conventional design drawings. And for the atlas, we asked them to draw on a couple of things. Just looking at a shot here of partially my floor, but also of Judith Shalansky's book, An Atlas of Remote Islands, which is basically a list of places she's never been and never will go, but does an excellent job of framing up what an atlas really is. And she writes in it that I didn't realize that my atlas, like every other, was committed to an ideology. Its ideology was clear from its map of the world, carefully positioned on a double-page spread, so that the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic fell on 2 separate pages. Geographical maps are abstract and concrete at the same time, and for all the objectivity of their measurements, they cannot represent reality, merely one interpretation of it. And so I've really asked students to lean into this idea of an atlas and the rest of their work as an ideological project, and to be purposeful about that and not to back into it. If you haven't read Judith's book, it's fantastic. It has beautiful cartography like this, but also has what are almost like dispatches from a ship manifest. These are oftentimes like the first colonizers to visit the island who wind up basically having to practice some form of cannibalism because they get there and it doesn't work out and their ship is wrecked and they can't get home. And they've done something to destroy a piece of the island's ecology or indigenous communities. And so she does a really excellent job of balancing, say, beautiful cartography with really critical analysis and historical writing. And just to give you a couple of quick shots, I'm not going to go through all of this because they each had like 300 slides for the mid-review, and I can't show you all of their work. But again, asking them this, you can see the students' credits at the bottom there. Asking them to think about their conceptual framework or manifesto for Appalachia, and then how to build an atlas around that. So here, they believe the carceral state, the fossil fuel industry, and the agriculture sector contribute to Appalachia's treatment as an internal colony within the United States, where it's been branded with the myth of monocultures and effectively been made into a sacrifice zone. And going through some different ways of diagramming that, drawing on Frida Brown and other folks, again, who've talked about the carceral archipelago of Appalachia. You're looking here at prison facilities with some kerning turned on to accentuate them. These are state-owned prison facilities in Appalachia to give you a sense of kind of the proportion of incarcerated individuals there relative to, say, the rest of Appalachia or the rest of the U.S. The U.S. is already the most people incarcerated per capita in the world. The Delta and Appalachia are the two top regions for that in the United States. They have the highest proportion of people incarcerated of any other part of the United States. And then thinking about the political economy of prison development, right? So there's a reason, right, that prison operations are basically a jobs guarantee program for many rural places in the U.S., where they're their employer of last resort. In some cases, they're the only employer. The jobs are incredibly traumatic for both, certainly the incarcerated people and for the folks who work in prisons, and they're heavily subsidized. They're funded through a variety of different ways. We can talk about it at the Q&A on the capital improvement investment side. And then also most of the prisons are paid on a per person basis. So their contract stipulates that basically every person they pack into the prison guarantees some extra amount of money for the prison owners, whether it's a private or state prison. And that actually in Appalachia now, it's not the majority use for abandoned landmines, but it's the plurality use for abandoned coal mines, is to be converted into a prison, which is like one of the most dire and dark things to come out of their studio analysis. And just to give you a sense of what those look like, right? These are again, you can understand, I think, like just from a pure like technical perspective, why this happens, in addition to this mountain of subsidies that stand up prison building and the prison industrial complex in the US. It's that the land has already been cleared in most cases of Appalachia. These are abandoned strip mines that can be easily converted into prison facilities, and so they are. And often the EPA is both able and willing to waive cleanup requirements at the sites because they are prisoners and not, say, housing residents or school children. With all of that like in mind, they're now beginning to connect with a variety of different on-the-ground movements in Appalachia who are thinking about, in their case, how to tackle these three sites through some of their work. So USP Letcher was a proposed prison site that has temporarily at least been halted by prison abolitionist organizers in Appalachia. There's the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which has been partially built, but also halted by climate justice protesters in parts of Appalachia. And the Monongahela National Forest, which again is a site that's not a fossil fuel or prison site, but is a massive timber industry site. It's a place that is mined, every few years for timber production. So thinking about these three sites, really, this was their mid-review charge, was to put three of these to us and let us talk about which ones make the most sense for them as they think about how to make an argument for sort of regional-wide change through a particular piece of infrastructure. And I won't spend a ton of time on this again because we're getting close to 7 o'clock here, and I want to make sure we have time to chat. But the Delta Group, is looking here at this sort of timeline of extraction from colonialization to the advent of the fossil fuel industry in the Delta. Again, drawing on some historical research we did as a part of the beginning of the studio there, where we asked historians from the region to come in and talk about work they've done, exposing some of the sort of landscapes of enslavement of the Mississippi Delta. And drawing heavily on folks like Clyde Woods, who aren't with us anymore, but who have written about this for a really long time. And then ask them to do a couple of things to make basically timelines that could help us understand this chronology of extraction in the region, which we won't spend a ton of time on, to give us a sense, like back of napkin level, like how much are we talking about here? In this case, $40 billion to subsidize new plantations, basically the agriculture system of the Delta, how much carbon emissions are associated with it, the total land area, and then the number of farming jobs, right? So if we think about our charge in many ways in the studio in the larger Green New Deal world, is being able to offer alternatives to these kind of employers of last resort in many parts of the country where I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. to the prison, industrial ag, and fossil fuel sector, then like we need to know what we're talking about. How many jobs, how well do they pay, how much land area are we talking about? And then also, like the Appalachia group, they've been really thoughtful about plugging into existing CJ and EJ movements that are already sort of imagining radical futures for the Mississippi Delta, far more radical, frankly, than like most design work, and asking how we can be, useful in the tools at our disposal to advancing their project there. And this group, this is one of the sites they proposed. This is the Northern Mississippi Delta Farms, just outside of Clarksdale. So I grew up just northwest of there in Helena, and then moved to Fort Smith on the other side of the state. And then they've done similar versions of this for the rest of the industries too. You're looking here at the carceral system, where they focused in on Angola Farm, the Angola State Penitentiary of Louisiana. If you don't know it, it's I think the second largest prison facility in the United States. It's larger than the island of Manhattan. It's named for the nation of Angola on the African continent, where almost all of its first incarcerated folks came from. And looks much today like it did in 1901 in that first picture you see there, prison labor working the field. It's still literally called farm. And here proposing that as kind of one of their sites of intervention in the region. And so I'll zip through these fossil fuel pieces pretty quickly, because again, using a similar method, but just to say again, they're kind of framing up these, there's two really like different approaches in many ways for these two groups, and there's a third group I'm not going to talk too much about because we're kind of out of time, but thinking about whether to tackle, say, the hardest sites first, the ones where there's, say, less probably in common with them than other prison or fossil fuel or industrial ag facilities in the region, or whether to choose those that are, say, the most, that share the most in common with other facilities like them, and whether their sort of proposed project is going to be tackling the hardest problem first or tackling the most common problem first. And that's the framework they've kind of used to build this out around. And what they'll do now, and we've kind of put to them after they get back from their week break after their mid-review, is to begin thinking about, what are the storytelling devices that can advance the work you want to do in each of these regions in ways that, again, conventional design drawings maybe don't lend themselves to. It might be graphic novels, it might be reimagined farmers' almanacs, it might be workbooks, it might be all kinds of field manuals or field guides. I think we're kind of leaving that to them to propose what that device might be. We'll have several conversations about it, and then we'll do a version of what we did last year where we invite the public in to have a conversation about the work in December. And so with that, I want to stop talking and look forward to having a discussion with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Fantastic, fantastic talk as always, and really compelling content. I am, so there's a couple of things. If obviously we want to have a bit of a discussion with Billy here. If you raise your hands in the chat with 100 of us, I think that's probably going to work best. Or put questions in the chat window for us. One question Taisa Way just brought up here really quickly as people start to raise their hands. Hi, Taisa. She says, I'm curious if you're working with Dark Matter University, DMU, and their shared studios would make for an interesting intersection of green and race. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about it. I think DMU's work and this studio were kind of getting organized at the same time, so there wasn't like an obvious opportunity to really merge them. But we have Killian Briano from DMU, Brian Lee from Colloquate and DMU involved on the studio jury. They're both also coming in for Desperate. So I think we're all like aware of each other's work, and I'm super interested in making all of the stuff we do public and like available to anyone who wants to use it for any reason. I think DMU is beginning to think about like what some of the spring collaborations will look like, but I don't teach in the spring, so I can't really like append some of this stuff to work that they're already doing. But I think the question's a great one. It's one that we should all like be thinking more about, how to do more collaborative work across institutions, and DMU is by far the best vehicle, I think, for doing that right now. Great. I will ask a quick question here. On my end, so you brought up the kind of idea around institutions and landscape architects working in different, particularly federal institutions. In that sense, coming from someone who's both fascinated by and frustrated with a group like the Army Corps of Engineers, I'm wondering, like in your experience with with the design professions, how we find our footing in there in kind of really strong ways, use design and our expertise in that realm, but where we might position ourselves, how we might find our way in, so that we're that we're not just visualizers of information, but we're also actually kind of active in the design of space. And so I don't know if you might be able to talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And one of your, I think one of your classmates, certainly one of your colleagues, Sean Burkholder, and I talk about this a lot. And Sean also does a ton of work with the Army Corps. And we talk about all the things that you all, and thinking of, let's say, y'all and then the DRC, the Dredge Research Collaborative, have learned about the Army Corps over, 10, 15 plus years of doing collaborative work with them. Sometimes it maybe feels like against them. And I think that's where there's a lot of really important work left to be done on thinking about how those lessons get shared in productive ways with folks at the Army Corps who actually really want to do good. They maybe don't always know how, but they absolutely want their work to be better. And in many offices attuned to the kinds of things I was talking about tonight. This is part of what the Climate and Community Project that I mentioned is going to try to do in the spring, is to collect some of that. We have a bunch of folks who are marine infrastructure, coastal infrastructure, policy wonks, who are wanting to do some kind of big, how do we reimagine the Army Corps? How do we reimagine the water infrastructure funding system in the United States? And it's going to require them to talk to folks like you and Sean and Gina Worth and everyone else at the Dredge Research Collaborative to figure out what it is about that institution, if anything, that is salvageable and is useful to some of these questions about how a Green New Deal gets realized. And which ones are not. And I'll just say, I spent, almost 3 years doing field work for my dissertation, often in places and with people who do a lot of work with the Army Corps. And there's a ton there that the Army Corps knows they need to change. They're just waiting for a mandate to change it. They can't do a lot of this stuff on their own. So for us anyway, I've been thinking about how the CCP can be a lever for exerting some pressure on the folks who can ask them to make some of the changes they've long wanted to make. The other thing I would say, just on the question of maybe where to think about spending one's time professionally, whether it's the Army Corps or another part of the public sector generally, there are just trade-offs, right? You probably are going to spend less time doing high design work or construction documentation or whatever it might be. But those institutions also offer the kind of scale and scope and pace of impact that's never going to be possible in a project by project kind of private practice fee for service model. And not one of those isn't better than the other, but I think one of those gets really heavily emphasized by the design professions, and it's not the public sector side. And so finding ways to at least hold those two things together in balance is going to be really important for us as we think about where landscape architects might fit within this potential for expanding the state around questions of climate justice through something like a Green New Deal.
Great, thanks. So we have a question from Ashley Davies and then Mona after that. So Ashley, would you like to turn your camera on or mic on?
Sure, I'm outside, so you're not going to be able to see me very well, but hi, Billy. Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm here in Charlottesville, and I guess I just had a couple of questions for you. I wanted to hear more about how your students are able to engage with the communities in which they are working and planning, and how much direct engagement they get with residents and communities. I also wondered your thoughts on how this work can apply specifically to transforming the history and wrongs of public housing, and also just thinking about how landscape architects can in that realm kind of engage in the food desert issue. I'm lucky enough to get to work a little bit with Barbara here in Charlottesville, and I think her engagement with public housing residents and that connection has been pretty transformative, and a major bridge of trust has been formed. And so I'm just curious to hear more about how we can do more of that in the academic realm.
Yeah, these are such great questions. And I would say, in the academy, we have the luxury, although not everyone takes advantage of it, kind of operating outside of market forces, right? So doing work that like isn't competing with the fee-for-service world of design or planning professions, and asking questions that like market forces don't allow private practice to ask, which often means, right, like working with public housing residents or working with other communities that are cut out of capital markets or closed to capital. And so for me, I'll stop using like the royal we and us, but like for me, that often means, right, that I'm working with either people or organizations or both who I've now spent at least like 3 or 4 years really building trust with and getting to know, often much longer, and who in many ways are kind of like the conduit to residents for us. So when I do work with folks at People's Action and the Homes Guarantee, like in Kansas City, I may not meet with literally every single public housing resident in the community where we're like focusing our work, but am meeting with their organizer and meeting with like the person who's running the campaign based out of Kansas City, and are asking them questions on day one about how we should shape our work, not how they should respond to work we've already done. And I think this is where, you know, the work that Ananya Roy has led at UCLA's Institute is really, really, really instructive, where she's essentially turned her institute inside out, given decision-making control of resources and agenda setting over to the housing justice movement of Los Angeles. There are versions of that we're trying to pilot in the McHarg Center here. It's very hard. UCLA is much more insulated as a place from, say, its benefactors than Penn is, so it makes some of that work harder to do here. But I would say like we're all looking for models like hers, like Barbara's, I think, to try and build the rest of our work around. And I think like for students in the class, it's particularly tough now, right? Because we can't go to any of these places. And partners I've had in each of these regions, again, for like several years, get asked to do stuff like this all the time. They often say yes to joining us in the studio because I do know them, like I have built up trust with them. And they don't say yes to everyone who asks because they get asked all the time. And so that's been one way. And you know, the other thing I would say too is that we have a couple students now former students now who've graduated and gone to work in a couple of these organizations and or like in, say, a policy space where those organizations are kind of centered. So a couple of them are doing climate justice policy work in Louisiana, in Appalachia, and in the Midwest, in large part because of relationships they built up over the course of the studio last year. And they're not conventional design offices. They're not going to be doing like, I don't know, like park or garden design, which again is fine. Like that's a thing lots of people will continue to do in landscape architecture for like the indefinite future. But they are doing work that for them anyway feels like it's advancing an ideological project that they share. And I think that's like all a long way around to saying, I think like the key for us, the key for me in this work has been building trust over years, and being really like transparent and honest about all the things that like I'm able to offer and do, and then delivering on those to communities that make promises to. Everyone looks at, I think, Penn and understands it's a obscenely wealthy place. Everybody looks at the School of Design and probably thinks the same. Like everybody looks at the McHarg Center from the outside and thinks, so we must just be like sitting on a pile of money. And we don't have nothing, but we also like don't have that much. Our budget is 1/10 the size of the next smallest center in the School of Design, which makes us probably the smallest center at the entire university. And so being upfront, like telling a group we're doing work with, here is the exact amount of my budget, like for the entire center for this semester. Here's how much of it I'm like willing to like put towards this project with you. Is again like a one way of like building trust and living up to those promises as we go.
Great. Mona, did you want to?
Yeah.
Something?
Hi, Billy. Thank you so much for your lecture. Very, very important material. I think you organized a series of events last semester, and I was already close to jumping into a train and joining some of the presentations. Really excited. So I'm excited that you're here with us today. So I have actually two questions. The first one is, a lot of the topics that you are raising are of interdisciplinary nature, and I was just wondering if you have any advice for us as educators or even our practitioners who are sitting in the session, how to get a grip on these topics. Obviously, designing is always an interdisciplinary topic, but I find the New Green Deal is really grabbing on some really deep topics that dive deep into rethinking what capitalism is. And I was just wondering if you have some advice for us. And the second one was, I was very curious on one of your first slides, you showed, I think it was a list of 10 important topics that you were looking at, and city-owned land was listed there. And I was wondering how you weigh the role of cities or public governments to take a stake on this, because I trust that in America, where it's so difficult to counterbalance market principles, that publicly owned land or city-owned land is an important player in changing the spatial agencies.
Yeah, again, these are such great questions. In some ways, like I have a lot of luxuries here that are maybe like don't transfer everywhere, right? So one is that I get to teach interdisciplinary option studios. So I always have at least city planners and landscape architects in the studio, often have architects as well. And that just lends itself to the kind of work in many ways that I was showing tonight. The other is that I think we also recognized pretty early on that we can't do everything. So like not everyone, whether in practice or academia, can do all of the things they want to do in either a single studio or a single project, or even like a single like research agenda lifetime. So like, how do we make some choices about what things we take on, what things we maybe are like supportive of, but can't spend considerable time on? And then what are the things that like other people are just better suited to tackle? We have lots of housers, like housing policy folks in the school who are like really keyed in on like the insanely like Rube Goldbergian like affordable housing production process of the United States, which like I'm not. So that's an area where they're going to spend a lot of time. I'm much more interested, right, in like the potential of what it might mean to be able to actually legally build new public housing in this country, into direct investment into like taking care of the infrastructure we already have. But I think like in the studio, so thinking about like how you even whether you're in an interdisciplinary like studio or not, like making choices about whose voices you bring into the studio is hugely important. And who you treat as like who you are, who you feel responsible to for the work. Which again, like for me, it would have been easy. There's nothing wrong with doing a climate like studio around, say, building a seawall in Miami or something. But like lots of people are doing that. I don't know that like that's like a place where we're going to break a ton of new ground in an academic studio. I think if you're talking about tooling folks up, like that's a great way to do it, to get them in, like invested in a really complex set of items. But for like an option studio at the end of their time here, like what are the things we can put them onto that might actually like change the trajectory of both like our students' professional lives and of say maybe potentially the communities that we're doing some work with. And so for us, like for me, like thinking about how to put a jury together that's primarily not design folks. So in this like giant jury I mentioned earlier of 20 people, maybe 10 are like from the design professions. The rest are either writers, activists, community partners, other folks who have a lot to say about the kind of work we do, and often aren't invited into say like the production of design work. And the other has been, for me anyway, it's been incredibly helpful to have this like hybrid seminar studio model where we do spend a lot of time in reading and discussion before anyone's really asked to begin making decisions about like how to imagine a future for a place they don't know. And I think for our students, it's both like a way of helping them develop conceptual frameworks that make the rest of their semester easier, and for kind of bringing everyone to like a shared space or a shared like foundation before we embark on what's a pretty like hectic and crazy studio with a bunch of open-ended like possibilities. And I still don't really know where this one will end. And so it helps, I think, kind of manage all of the uncertainty that goes into a studio model like that.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more question if you have time in the, so Mark says he has noise in the house, so I'll ask it for him. Just Billy, thank you for a great introduction to the layered research and studio work. Given your goal to make the outcomes of the work widely accessible, are you considering making the studio work accessible to the broader public in a manner akin to posters, art, and other media from the New Deal?
Yeah, so Mark, hello. Short answer is yes. So the work should be up on our site by the end of the fall. I'm sure like UVA have had like a million different hiring freeze like things to negotiate. So it would have been up probably at the beginning of the semester if not for that. But our web design developer folks are now like producing basically a page for that studio work. Same will be true for this one. The posters, I'm almost 100% sure, I will check with them before I send you the link, but I'm almost 100% sure are like in an Etsy shop for 5 cents or something for one of my former students. A lot of my friends and like comrades already have them printed and hanging in their places. So you can literally do that anytime you want. The last time I took a couple of students to DC before the lockdown back in February, and President Cortez's office already had them hanging, which was pretty cool. They were in on our studio reviews, so they also we sent them a couple of posters and they actually hung them up. Maybe just for that day, they did like what my grandma used to do. Like she would put my picture up the day I was coming over and then take it down and put someone else's up. But anyway, like someone managed that pretty well. And they're hanging in a few other places as well. So I think like that's a long way around to saying that work will all be public. I think that's like, for me anyway, the aim has always been to try and like come somewhere close to the model that Ann Spirn has like really, I think, honed for us about making literally every scrap of scholarship or work that we produce available to anybody who wants it. Her website is phenomenal at doing this. And so, yeah, I think that work should be up by the end of the semester, and hopefully this studio's work is up sooner than the last one was.
Billy, thank you so much. Thanks for taking all the questions. Thanks for the lecture. It's really fantastic to have you.